The laugh lasted 3 seconds. Not long, but long enough. Long enough for Margaret Hale to remember it years later. Not the cheese. Not the awards. Not the labels. The laugh. Because it came from a man who never even looked at her numbers. He looked at the size of her dairy and decided everything else from there. Margaret stood inside the Mason County Dairy Co-op office, holding production records while Harold Briggs flipped through paperwork. Then stopped. Then laughed. Short. Automatic. Dismissive. The kind of laugh people make when they think they've already solved the problem. How many cows? Margaret answered. Harold blinked. Then laughed again. No. Silence. Margaret frowned. No. No. Long pause. Then, what does that mean? Harold leaned back in his chair. It means you're too small. The answer irritated her immediately, because she'd heard it before. For years. The Hale Dairy sat high in the Missouri hills where most producers operated large commercial herds. Hundreds of cows. Massive milk tanks. Constant expansion. Everything centered around volume. More milk. More cows. More production. Margaret's dairy looked different. Very different. The farm originally belonged to her grandfather, Samuel Hale, a stubborn man who measured success differently than most people. One summer evening when Margaret was 13, she followed him through a pasture overlooking the valley. Jersey cows grazed quietly beneath golden sunlight. Samuel pointed toward them. See anything? Margaret frowned. Cows. Samuel laughed. Yes. Long pause. Good cows. She looked again. Still cows. Nothing special. At least to her. What makes them good? Samuel smiled. The milk. Silence. Then, milk is milk. Samuel stopped walking, turned toward her, and shook his head. No. That answer stayed with her. Because Samuel repeated it for years. Milk wasn't milk. Not really. Some milk carried more butter fat. Some carried more protein. Some made better cheese. Some made better butter. Some made everything better. Most people just never looked closely enough to notice. Samuel did. The Hale Dairy remained small by design. 48 cows. Then 50. Then 52. Never much more. But every generation focused heavily on genetics. Milk quality. Butter fat. Protein. Animal health. Things invisible from the road. Things difficult to explain. Things the market rarely rewarded. After Samuel passed away, Margaret inherited everything. The herd. The dairy. And decades of records. Most people expected her to expand. Borrow money. Build larger facilities. Buy more cows. Instead, she did something unusual. She kept improving the herd. Which confused everybody. Especially dairy brokers. One afternoon, Dale Harper leaned against a pasture fence watching jerseys graze. You know what your problem is? Margaret smiled faintly. Apparently, everybody does. Dale pointed toward the herd. Those cows. Silence. What about them? You don't have enough. Long pause. Then, enough for what? Dale folded his arms. To matter. Margaret looked toward the pasture. Then back at him. Do they make good milk? That isn't the point. She smiled. Maybe it is. That answer irritated Dale immediately. As usual. Years passed. The dairy survived. Not easily, but steadily. Feed costs remained manageable. Animal health stayed excellent. Milk quality improved every year. Yet every time Margaret approached larger buyers, the same conversation returned. Again, and again, and again. Too small, too small, too small. The words followed her everywhere. One winter evening, Emily Hale sat across from her at the kitchen table. Production reports covered every available surface. Milk tests, butterfat reports, protein percentages, breeding records, everything. Emily looked around. You're doing it again. Margaret looked up. What? The reports. Silence. The reports. That means you're thinking. Long pause. Then, yes. Emily sighed. Dangerous. Very dangerous. What kind of thinking? Margaret pointed toward the paperwork. Milk. Emily immediately looked nervous. Because milk thinking usually cost money. Bad milk thinking? Margaret smiled. Maybe. The next morning, she drove to the co-op and found Harold Briggs. The meeting lasted 6 minutes. 6. Margaret brought records. Actual records. Years of data. Milk composition reports. Laboratory testing. Performance numbers. Everything. Harold barely looked at them. Instead, he looked at herd size. Then stopped listening. You need more cows. Margaret folded her arms. Why? Silence. Harold blinked. Why? Yes. Long pause. Because that's how dairy works. Margaret looked down at the reports. Then back at him. My butterfat averages nearly 6%. Harold shrugged. My protein numbers are among the highest in the county. Another shrug. My cows stay productive longer. Harold smiled patiently. The dangerous kind. The kind people use when they think someone doesn't understand reality. Margaret. Silence. What? You don't have enough milk. That sentence stayed with her the entire drive home. Because something about it felt wrong. Very wrong. The dairy produced excellent milk. Objectively excellent. Laboratory tested excellent. Yet nobody seemed interested. Months passed. Then another season. Then another. The frustration grew. One afternoon she stood inside the milk house staring at stainless steel tanks. Years of work surrounded her. Generations of breeding decisions. Careful management. Attention to detail. All of it reduced to one sentence. You don't have enough milk. Emily found her there. You okay? Margaret laughed once. Not because anything felt funny. Because otherwise she might have been angry. The co-op says I'm too small. Silence. Emily folded her arms. Compared to who? Long pause. Then, everyone. The answer lingered. Because that was exactly the problem. Margaret spent years comparing herself to larger dairies. Larger facilities. Larger operations. Larger numbers. Maybe she was asking the wrong question. That realization arrived unexpectedly. One rainy afternoon she stopped at a specialty food conference in St. Louis. Mostly because she happened to be nearby. Mostly because admission was free. Mostly because she wanted to think about something other than milk. Then she walked into a tasting hall. And everything changed. Cheese. Everywhere. Small producers. Artisan makers. Regional specialties. 100 different flavors. 100 different stories. And one thing immediately stood out. Nobody talked about volume. Nobody. They talked about quality. Origin. Flavor. Milk. Specific milk. That bothered her. Because suddenly she realized something. The people making extraordinary cheese cared deeply about the exact things Harold ignored. Butterfat. Protein. Flavor. Consistency. Everything her herd excelled at. The idea followed her home. Then stayed. For weeks. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table researching artisan cheesemakers. Maps covered half the surface. Names. Locations. Phone numbers. Production notes. Emily walked in and stopped immediately. Oh no. Margaret looked up. What? Emily pointed. The maps. Silence. The maps. That means you've got an idea. Long pause. Then. Maybe. Emily sat carefully. Dangerous. Very dangerous. What kind of idea? Margaret pointed toward a cheesemaker's website. A small operation several states away. Award-winning. Respected. Obsessed with milk quality. Emily stared. Then looked up. Then back again. No. 3 weeks later a dusty truck rolled into the Hale dairy yard. Out-of-state plates. Mud on the doors. A long drive. The vehicle stopped beside the milk house. A man climbed out. Gray-haired. Well-dressed. Travel-worn. He looked tired. Then he looked at the cows. And smiled. A real smile. Not the polite kind. Not the business kind. The kind people make when they've finally found something. He walked toward Margaret. Extended his hand. My name's Henry Lawson. Margaret shook it. Nice to meet you. Henry looked toward the jerseys again. Then back. And asked a question nobody from the co-op had ever asked. Can I see your milk tests? Margaret stared at the man for several seconds. Because nobody had ever asked that question before. Not once. The co-op asked herd size. Buyers asked volume. Brokers asked tank capacity. Nobody asked about the milk itself. Henry Lawson waited patiently. Then smiled. Is that a strange question? Margaret laughed softly. A little. She led him into the office. Moments later production reports covered the table. Butterfat tests. Protein reports. Somatic cell counts. Years of records. Henry studied them silently. Then frowned. Then looked again. Then sat back. Good grief. Margaret blinked. What? Henry pointed to the reports. This can't be right. Silence. Then. It is. He looked at her. 6% butterfat. Yes. Consistently. Yes. Long pause. Then. Why aren't you making cheese? That question changed everything. The next several hours disappeared. Henry toured the dairy. Watched milking. Examined feed programs. Studied breeding records. Asked endless questions. And the more he learned, the happier he looked. Finally, they stood beside the pasture watching Jersey cows graze. Henry folded his arms. You know what your problem is? Margaret laughed. Apparently, everybody does. He pointed toward the dairy. You've been talking to commodity buyers. Silence. Then. So. Henry smiled. Commodity buyers buy volume. He pointed toward the cows. I buy milk. That answer stayed with her. Because suddenly everything made sense. The co-op wasn't wrong. It simply valued different things. Volume mattered there. Quality mattered here. 3 weeks later, Henry returned. This time carrying a contract. Margaret read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Because surely she'd misunderstood. Surely. You want all of it. Henry nodded. Yes. All my milk. Yes. Silence. Then. Why? Henry smiled. Because I can't find this quality anywhere else. The agreement changed the farm overnight. No longer would the milk disappear anonymously into a giant processing system. Now it went directly to Henry's creamery. Directly into artisan cheese. Directly into products built around quality instead of quantity. The first year felt strange. Very strange. Henry called constantly. Not with complaints. With excitement. The milk produced exceptional cheese. Exceptional texture. Exceptional flavor. Exceptional aging characteristics. Every batch performed beautifully. Then something happened nobody expected. Customers started asking questions. Specifically, where does this milk come from? Henry smiled every time. Because he already knew the answer. The second year he introduced a new cheese line. A premium wheel aged longer and produced in limited quantities. At the launch event, he unveiled the packaging. Margaret nearly dropped it. Because printed directly on every wheel were 3 words. Hail Hill Dairy. Silence. Absolute silence. She stared. Then looked up. You named it after the farm? Henry smiled. Yes. Long pause. Why? He looked genuinely confused. Because that's where the flavor comes from. The cheese became successful. Then more successful. Then unexpectedly successful. Food magazines mentioned it. Restaurants requested it. Specialty retailers ordered it. Awards followed. Then more awards. People across several states suddenly knew the name Hail Hill Dairy. Meanwhile, back home, the county struggled to understand what happened. One morning, Dale Harper walked into the co-op carrying a magazine. Then tossed it onto the counter. Harold Briggs looked down. A photograph filled the cover. Premium artisan cheese. Below it, made from milk supplied exclusively by Hail Hill Dairy. Silence. Harold stared. Then looked again. Then frowned. No. Dale smiled. Yes. No. Yes. The room became very quiet. Because everybody remembered. The meetings. The conversations. The warnings. The endless statements about being too small. A week later, Margaret stopped by the co-op. The room immediately fell silent. Not completely. Just enough. Harold stood near the coffee counter, looking uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Finally, he cleared his throat. Well. Margaret looked over. Well. Long pause. You seem to be doing all right. The room waited. Because everybody knew that wasn't really what he wanted to say. Margaret nodded politely. Yes. Silence. Then Harold asked. That cheesemaker still buying your milk? Margaret smiled slightly. All of it. More silence. Then. Every day. Yes. Nobody spoke. Because there wasn't much left to say. Years later, the dairy still remained small. That surprised people. Margaret never expanded dramatically. Never borrowed millions. Never chased volume. Instead, she focused on what made the herd special. The same things her grandfather valued. The same things everyone else ignored. One autumn evening, she stood beside a pasture overlooking the valley. The sun sank low behind the hills. Jersey cows grazed quietly below. Dale stood beside her. You know what still bothers me? Margaret smiled. What? He pointed toward the herd. I laughed. Yes. No, seriously. Long pause. For years. Wind moved through the grass. The cows continued grazing. Peaceful. Steady. Exactly as they always had. For years, people looked at Margaret Hale's dairy and saw a problem. Too small. Too limited. Too insignificant. Then one cheesemaker looked at the same farm and saw something entirely different. Not a quantity problem. A quality opportunity. The co-op measured milk by the tank. Henry Lawson